In this second lecture of the course on evolutionary influences on food consumption, I'm going to be talking about food neophobia and neophobia reduction. Now, I introduced the term in the first lecture, but I didn't say anything about what neophobia actually means. The name, well, the clue I should say, is in the name, neophobia, an avoidance or fear of the new. And that's exactly what food neophobia is. It's the avoidance of unfamiliar tastes or foods. This is particularly pronounced early in life. Generally, for most species, but for humans, it is perhaps most pronounced in between the ages of about 2 to 4, 2 to 6 broadly. This is consistent with the idea that that is the period in a human infant's life where they begin to explore the food world, independent of parental feeding. Under the age of 2, pretty much all food that goes into a human was directly put there by its parents. After the age of 2, they start walking around, and at that point, they start putting other things in their mouths. A fact I can definitely attest to as a parent. And so I'm quite glad that food neophobia exists because, in a sense, it controls for exposure to novel tastes. And one of the things about the substances out there in the world is that some of them are truly toxic or poisonous. You don't want to eat just anything. You only want to eat safe things. And so, this unconditioned process, this neophobia, this automatic avoidance of unfamiliar foods, is actually one of the key protective mechanisms from our evolutionary past to avoid poisoning ourselves, especially as young children. Because while young children love to explore, the process of neophobia prevents them from ingesting too much of a novel taste. And the thing about a novel taste is it's one that you don't know is safe. And so, this process, this neophobia, is actually one of the key evolutionary benefits or tools that has been given us to control our food preferences and eating, because it avoids unknown and potentially toxic foods. Now, clearly, neophobia is going to be useful in terms of protecting from potentially toxic or poisonous foods, but if it was complete, then we'd never eat anything new. If every human had complete food neophobia, then we would never eat anything, because something has to be eaten for the first time. And so one of the interesting things about neophobia is that it is not typically a complete rejection of a new taste. It is more typically a partial rejection. Small amount sampled, and then stop. If you've ever tried to convince a 2-year-old to eat their greens, it's normally reasonably easy to get them to have the first bite. The second bite, much harder. And that is actually, even though it's a very informal example, a very clear reflection of careful experimental work on neophobia. That novel foods and tastes are indeed avoided, but not absolutely completely. Now, what happens when a food is no longer novel? Neophobia, defined as a phobia of the new, implies that once a taste is no longer new, then you wouldn't see neophobia. And actually, one of the key things that determines food preference and food choice is exposure. The single simplest prediction about a food preference is that we will prefer the things we have been exposed to the most. Now, the thing about this process, neophobia, the original avoidance of novel foods or tastes, and neophobia reduction, learning to do away with that fear of the new, is that it's not simply about consumption. It turns out that neophobia is most strong for flavours that have innately avoided tastes. So things like sour and bitter, as I mentioned in the first lecture in this course. But it's not just the avoidance of these things. If you look very carefully at the face of a human infant when they are first exposed to a sour or bitter taste, you see a very clear aversive facial reaction. Horribly big gapes. And actually, this sort of facial reaction is preserved across many mammalian species, which supports animal experiments looking at these processes as well. Interestingly, these aversive reactions can be contrasted to the innate facial reactions that are elicited by preferred tastes, like sweet or salty. And you would see things like tongue protrusions and lip licking when infants are first exposed to innately preferred tastes like sweet. What's interesting when we look at neophobia reduction is that the first time that a novel taste is experienced, it will quite commonly elicit aversive facial reactions. As I say, these are observable in human infants, but are preserved across other animal species, and so it's something that can be formally studied in the lab. Now, the initial neophobic reaction, low consumption, avoidance, and aversive facial reactions indicating that not only is this new flavour not preferred, but it's actively disliked. With time and with exposure, actually not only does consumption increase, but the facial patterns themselves change. As the taste becomes familiar and not neophobic, then it also becomes liked. Now, I mentioned that one of the key determinants of what we prefer in terms of foods is exposure. And this is often referred to as the mere exposure effect. Simply experiencing a food leads to a later preference. However, it is worth noting that in the real world, things are a little bit more complicated. If you imagine what happens if I was to consume a foodstuff that I've never had before, then several things are going to happen. I will taste it, it will be novel, and therefore neophobia would suggest that I won't consume much of it. However, the fact that I have consumed some of it will mean not only that I have experience of that, but that I will also have experience of the consequences of consuming that food. And if there are nutrients in that food, then that is going to support future learning in terms of pairing the taste with positive nutritive consequences. And so, while in abstract it's easy to talk about neophobia and neophobia reduction as if it is separate from preference learning, which, as I mentioned in the first lecture, is the subject of an entirely separate course, it's not in practice as though these things are entirely separate from each other. The same exposure that allows for neophobia reduction also allows for the processes, be they individual learning, social or cultural learning, that support the development of preferences of foods. One of the interesting things about neophobia is that not only can we study it in the lab, it's something that we can easily see in our own experience. For me, The clearest example is coffee. Horrible bitter taste, at least to a naive infant, but now something that I simply couldn't do without in my life. I love the taste of coffee. What changed? Well, clearly I've been exposed to it. It's no longer novel, and so there won't be any neophobia. But in that process of exposure and getting rid of neophobia, then I have also had the opportunity to experience the consequences that go with the taste of coffee, namely caffeine and the way it wakes me up in the morning, which is a very positive outcome. So, this lecture was about neophobia and neophobia reduction, essentially the avoidance of a novel taste and then the reduction in that avoidance by the formation of a memory that that taste is safe. So replacing the novelty with the idea of learning that the food is safe, and also the consequences that allows flavour preference learning of various forms through the exposure. The next lecture in this series will look at the opposite of this idea of learning a safe memory and look at taste aversion, so essentially forming an unsafe memory for a novel food.